Welcome back to the stage, Richard Salsman on Jean-Baptiste Say, Ayn Rand, and political economy.
So yesterday we did methodology and what I called the primacies, and Ayn Rand on the primacy of existence and Say on the primacy of production. And apropos this conference specifically, I wanted to start today with happiness and what they said about each, how they differ in what they said about each, which is interesting because there's an altruist interlude, which is interesting. About halfway between their two influences, so what makes them different about their treatment. Before I do, and then I'll finish with capitalism, and then and I'm going to also try to finish earlier so we have more time for Q&A. So I'll still have 20 minutes or more, I hope, 25 minutes for Q&A. Some of you may know, Professor Biondi may know this, there has been in the last decade a proliferation of happiness studies. Or well-being studies, right? And it's not that this hadn't been done before. In the earlier decades, it had been done mostly by psychologists. So what's new in the last few decades, mostly the last couple decades, is social scientists. So this is where it can get dangerous. So social scientists being political science, economists, sociologists. So before I launch into Say and Rand, I just wanted to give you a flavor of how this is being done. But the first point is, I think it's actually a positive. You know, the fact that they would say, let's look beyond GDP and let's look at wider measures of human development and human happiness, beyond just per capita income. That's a good thing, actually, I think. The UN even has something called the HDI, the Human Development Index. It's not bad. It's things like literacy and it's more an attempt to measure living standards, not just income. So it's not just, I have $50,000 in income, but, can I afford a house and what kind of infrastructure do I have in the country I'm living in? So these measures are also done globally. So actually, I think that's a good thing, because if the focus is on how to measure this thing objectively, they're in a way accepting the thing as good, and human happiness and human well-being. But be aware of, here's what I've noticed, and I'm no specialist in this field, but this is what I have read. The questions basically come like this. So this is also all important, the survey questions. Are you very happy? Are you somewhat happy? This is from one survey. Are you somewhat happy? Are you not so happy? Are you not happy at all? I'm not sure how else I would do it, but see, what's lacking there is a definition of happiness. So the definition is lacking. If it started with happiness is this, are you any of these things? No, so that is already a problem, because people will subjectively and variously define happiness. And then the other thing I notice is there's no time horizon. I mean, the idea, are you happy? You mean now, this minute, while I'm doing the survey? You know how people are. Well, I had a good week, but not a very good year. So as we'll see, Rand has this view of happiness as an enduring, keyword, enduring emotion, over long periods of time. So that's a problem as well. How do people answer these things with a sufficient time horizon, right? Even when they come to conclusions, these social scientists will refer to this as subjective well-being or subjective happiness, so they don't even believe these are really objective measures, but that doesn't make them not use them. Guess how they use them? Some of the major conclusions are that happiness is a relative thing. Now get this now. In other words, they find in some cultures, if there's wide discrepancies in income and status, people are less happy, even if the overall absolute level is higher. And if the absolute standard of living, say, is lower, but there's fewer differences, people are happier. Okay, again, very subjective, but it feeds in entirely to the egalitarian premise, doesn't it? That, wow, differences are what matter. If you know, any of you in athletics or in track and field events. Have you ever seen the concept of personal best? Athletes will have this, swimmers will have this, and runners will have this. They're not team sports. The personal best to them is they're not comparing themselves to other swimmers or other runners. They're comparing themselves to the best race they ever won. So notice how it's a standard, but it's also focused on yourself, not on others, right? So I think often these studies have as their premise, or maybe even the people they're surveying, otherism. I'm going to measure this. I'm going to measure my status relative to others. And since we're told to be preoccupied with others, it could well be that these measures come out this way because we're told to obsess about others. And if we feel inferior to others, that could detract from our happiness, right? To feel like we're maybe generate resentfulness and envy. So I've actually seen studies where the headline is the problem of envy and resentment, and I click on it and I think, wow, this is going to be a take on Ayn Rand's view, the age of envy or something. It's going to criticize envy. And the studies, what they actually do is they say envy comes out of wide discrepancies in income and performance, and the way to fight envy is to redistribute wealth. Not to say that envy is a vice. Don't do it. Don't be otherist. Because they're not going to come out against altruism or egalitarianism. But it's a very sneaky kind of approach. They say, yeah, envy is a problem. It's a real problem, and we need to fight it, and that's the way to fight it. So they're not going to question otherism or egalitarianism. Yeah, and just the last point I mentioned, the egalitarians, but these studies are used, you can imagine, they're used by redistributionists, but also paternalism is a big deal. Paternalism, the idea that all we have out there in society is not independent people, but basically large infants, infantile, not able to take care of themselves. And there's a very paternalistic attitude that comes out of that. If the citizenry are like children, the parent is going to be the government, right? We're parenting, we're making sure you have savings and Social Security and this and that, because you can't do that for yourself, So the society where people are not psychologically independent, they become dependent on others, they become parasitical, they become dependent on the government. And of course, utilitarianism. The minute you start talking about happiness, if you're not an individualist or not on the personal best premise, these utilitarians will argue that we can increase societal happiness. We can, economists call it social utility, by increasing the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers. So you're back into John Stuart Mill and Bentham and a rights-violating context, right? Where, well, if I can take a little happiness from Robert, who has way too much of it, and wouldn't miss this little fraction, and this other person over here is, you're miserable, and if you would benefit more, on the margin, benefit more. When students give me egalitarian stuff, arguments, or complaints, or why, there's two examples that I give that silence them. I don't want to silence my students, but sometimes it's fun to silence them with that answer. But one is grades. Yeah, I really think the grades are distributed unequally. Students, let's more equally distribute the grades. Well, I put in effort. Well, you didn't build that. There's no desert. I don't see any desert connection between you. So if you go, we should redistribute wealth. And I say, we could redistribute grades. The failing student really needs those grades. They never endorse that. And now to handle this from a social utility standpoint. I am sighted, not in the literature. I have eyesight. I have 2 eyeballs. And suppose Mr. Kalin is blind. So I say to the students, it is clearly an increase in social utility if I have one of my eyes, removed and given to him. We can do that now, right? We can do eye transplants. I think we can do that, right? You go from a fully sighted person and a blind person to 2 sighted persons. It clearly, now I go down a little bit, that's true. I might lose some depth, but I'm not blind. I might lose some depth perception. I have one eye. But he becomes sighted. Students are like, yeah, that is a clear social utility gain, net gain in social happiness and social utility. But then they're appalled because they realize, okay, this is not just taking money out of a paycheck. And this is plucking the eye out, and they're like, well, that. But on principle, if you say, okay, you're going to draw a line here, why? Because it's bodily, not paycheck. That only goes so far. They always have reasons to. But the eyeball thing really bothers them. It's not my example, by the way. It's in Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, 1974, a libertarian philosopher who, at Harvard. So he has the eyeball plucking example, which I like. Happiness. I think the methodology and the primacies, in a way, feed into their theories and their views on happiness. But notice this difference right up front. I'll say this, and that per se, I did not intend that. I swear I didn't intend that. It's a consequence of liberty, industriousness. Now, some of these are virtues, right? Industriousness, frugality, not ones that Ayn Rand specifically mentioned, but she would certainly endorse. I mean, industriousness is productiveness. Frugality means savings. That was a great presentation earlier today, by the way, on personal finance and savings. Peace, now peace meaning no war. Say just had this idea that it was easier to be happy without war, of course. Well, of course. Prosperity. So these are great things. They're not as deeply philosophical as Rand would come up with, but he has these, and I'll give you some quotes from him, and it's really great, because he also does not think that self-interest is a vice. He doesn't quite say it's a moral thing in the way Rand would. He says it has such wonderful consequential effects that it's a worthy motive. And there are some things he does say about the problems of sacrificing, the problems meaning not so much moral problems, but it just harms your life. So this is kind of relevant to the happiness and flourishing thing. The idea that his premise would be flourishing and happiness are important. What are the ingredients of that? That's his basic approach. He's against sloth. Well, that's the opposite of industriousness. Against prodigality. That's the opposite of frugality. And of course, poverty. Now, for Rand, as I said, it's this enduring emotion. It's a consequence. She actually says, in Galt's speech, she actually says it's the moral purpose of your life. So now it's not the standard of morality. It's not the standard by which we gauge what actions we take and whether they're moral or not. But it is the consequence. 1 second, I'm just... And practicing the virtues, I won't go through all the virtues, you know them very well, are something that yields our happiness. The most crucial one, of course, being rationality. And we know that Rand is careful about not confusing this pursuit with hedonism, which would be an emotion-driven, short-range approach, not an enduring, long-range approach, nor emotionalism, which is the kind of David Hume emotive theory of ethics, nor myopic, short range, nor fleeting. And by the way, there's an essay I've written that you might get some value out of it. It's called, and it was published in your publication, Reason Papers, Common Caricatures of Self-Interest and Their Common Source. And I named 7. So this is a good thing to arm yourself with, because it's the 7 caricatures of self-interest people will come at you with. You know, this is why self-interest is terrible. And it even rhymes. So I have like myopic, sadistic, materialistic, atomistic, automatic. So there are various ways of people caricaturing self-interest, and of course Rand avoids all these, but it might give you a nomenclature you can help. That will help you. And now, of course, her in contrast to altruism, which sees happiness and joy as something that's actually maybe a sign that you're not doing the right thing, that you're either not being moral or outright being immoral. And then the flip side of that, for the real sadistic ones, are if you're actually suffering in some way, that could be a sign that you're doing the right thing. Because altruism can't simply be the otherism of, well, I'm helping my brother. That's a little too close. Or my friend. It has to be a stranger, right? It has to be down that list of people, because then it shows that you're not selfishly motivated and you're helping, right? And then of course, it can't just be some distant stranger like, I don't know, I could give money to Warren Buffett. He's a distant stranger. I don't know him. But that wouldn't count. Why would that not count as altruism? Because he doesn't need it. Yeah, so I need to find a distant person I don't know who's really suffering, and I would be harmed by giving to them. She rejects all that. And of course, Say does as well. I just wanted to make that distinction. But also, let me here just make this distinction before I forget it, this altruist interlude I referred to. If you said to Say, what about altruism? He would say, what are you talking about? I've never heard of the phrase. I'm not, corrupt enough to think of such a thing. Because as I think Craig Biddle said earlier, Auguste Comte, C-O-M-T-E, in the mid-1800s, coined that word. It's true you could get it in earlier thought, religious thought and everything like that. But the coining of it and I think the extremity with which Comte presented it was just not available to someone like Say, who, if it was, still would have rejected it. And so it's in a way it's Ayn Rand's treatment of it, of advocating egoism and happiness and flourishing, is also in the context of this very extreme opposite approach of altruism, flat out suffering. I mean, even the Christians don't say that, right? The Kantian sense of it. Because they say you could get a benefit and a reward in heaven for helping others, right? That's a kind of distant, egoistic payoff, too selfish for, according to the Kantians, Auguste Comte. So Rand, happiness, the state of consciousness that proceeds from the achievement of one's values. We've heard a lot of that on this conference, which is great. If a man values productive work, his happiness is the measure of his success in the service of his life. And of course, it's not just material values that are produced. Neither life nor happiness can be achieved by the pursuit of irrational whims. Okay, so this is a rejection we know of this hedonism or subjectivism. And just as a reminder of Kant and the opposite approach, morality is not properly the doctrine of how we make ourselves happy. Right. It is not necessary that while I live happily. Happiness is not an ideal of reason. And he also had very much on this idea of suffering. He did say, suffering is a signal of right action, right moral action. Rational values pursued rationally, Rand is pretty clear about that. Here's the pursuit of happiness that the founders spoke of. But she says one's own happiness, an emotional state of happiness, has to be achieved in a rational way, pursuing rational values. So I guess you could have the opposite. You could irrationally pursue what seems like a rational value, or irrationally pursue a career. But you got to do both. You got to rationally pursue what you find as rational values. And there's life as an end in itself. Life is the standard, happiness the result. Now, Say is remarkably good on this. The purpose of a moral code, according to him, is happiness, but then he stresses happiness according to man's nature. So this is very Aristotelian, right? This is very Baconian, a focus on, well, what are humans? And it's what human beings need. The goal, he said, of all rules of morality. Now, this is probably too broad a statement because the rules of an altruist morality wouldn't do this, but the goals of what he's saying, right morality, correct morality, is to gain for human beings all the happiness compatible with their nature. It's quite a statement. In effect, rules of conduct can only be of two types: those that have as their object our own safety and welfare, and then he goes on to say those that concern others. They obviously valued others. If they're faithfully followed, by faith here he doesn't mean religiously, he means with integrity, consistently followed, each person will enjoy the virtues of all others. So there's enjoyment here. This is not virtue as a hair shirt in a medievalist sense. That joy comes from this. And there's, quote, mutually advantageous contract. If a nation were to recognize and generally follow rules of morality, these rules, it would be what we call in a favorable exchange. It would be the happiest of nations. And I won't go further from there. But this is from Olby. Olby is, if you look at the dates, about 3 years before the treatise. So he was interested in moral issues and the happiness of society before he penned treatise, although in Olby he actually says one crucial important thing that will be necessary for the happiness of society is a really well-written treatise on political economy, which he happened to be writing at the time. So it could have been a footnote to say, to follow in 3 years. Look for my book. Now, he thought you guys could not be happy fully unless you knew some political economy. I like that. I'm favorable to the strictest morality. Okay, now this sounds a little puritanical, say. I'm a little worried here. But no, and to the liberty which every human being ought to possess of disposing of his person, fortune and talents according to the bent of inclination. Every time he uses inclination, it's been translated as self-interest, which is interesting. Without which, indeed, individual happiness and national prosperity are empty sounds. Okay, without self-interest as the motive, without that, you're not going to get happiness. So it has a consequential effect as well. I've considered happiness as compensation, but it also should be seen as a means. That's interesting. As a compensation is like Ayn Rand's view that it's the payoff, so to speak. It's the emotional payoff we get. That's what he means by compensation. We're being compensated. Notice the economic terms he uses. As a return on investment here, if you engage the virtues, you will be repaid, and dividends will flow to you, that kind of thing. So, a true happiness is made up out of, not out of diversions, but of a constant and sustained satisfaction. That sounds like enduring. It's got to be sustained. It can't be one of these parties that you have. But notice the prior line. But joy is not happiness, and fireworks are not the least good for morality. So, against firework displays. Now, this is a metaphor. He's using a metaphor for no like burst of excitement is going to be an enduring thing. So, not against fireworks. This one's interesting and relates to the prior, not Alex, but the prior speaker about saving and frugality. You ever hear the phrase conspicuous consumption? Oh, capitalism. With its conspicuous consumption, the wealthy robber barons in their big houses on Newport, flaunting their wealth in our face, right? They're conspicuously consuming. A very otherism motive, by the way, right? I don't know of any of the robber barons who really give a damn about whether other people see them as well. They were enjoying their wealth, right? But they achieved what they did by caring about their own businesses and their own happiness. But Say out here comes out against basically conspicuous displays of luxury. It's really not so much anti-capitalism as he thinks some of these motives are other-oriented. They are conspicuous displays. They're wasteful, and why would you do this? And sure, it's okay to. He's not a Puritan. It's okay to have fun in life. But he actually here comes out against conspicuous, kind of frivolous displays of wealth. By the way, somebody asked me earlier, and so I wanted to mention it here. If you want these slides, get some of the quotes and things like that, just email me at rmsalzman@intermarketforecasting.com. This is an interesting quote about the men of the mind, really, the atlases, because this is a discussion, I won't go through the whole thing, this is an interesting discussion of, like, someone brought up plagues and famines the other day. And Say is talking about the effects on population of real human disasters, like plagues and famines and floods. His concern, notice, is with the loss of really intelligent people. That sounds a little harsh, but the superior enlightened humans most enhance human happiness. So The real danger in losing populations is they might contain really brilliant atlases. It's really big. This one I'll skip over, but he makes a fascinating connection between being frugal in private affairs and frugality in public affairs. And he has a very fascinating theory that says if the government sets a bad example, if it deficit spends, if it itself isn't careful in its spending, it's going to spread through the culture a similar kind of reckless attitude. And we think about, say, people borrowing too much or putting nothing down for their home and reckless credit card debt and everything like that. And then the economists and policymakers can complain about this, but then when you look at what Washington's actually doing, it's way worse because it's not even their own money, right? But he's very much interested in this idea that government should set a good example, that bad government behavior doesn't necessarily flow up from the voters. So, to sum up here, as a political economist, he's focused more on narrower issues than Rand was, mainly on the production and enjoyment of material values. But he's very good on celebrating commercial value per se, and saying that they flow from these very objectivist-sounding virtues, and also teaching how to multiply them and spread them. This work on Olby particularly was an essay contest. So he entered an essay contest, and it became more than an essay. It became a small booklet. And the question was, how can we improve the morals of a culture? I wanted to say something about capitalism. I know Professor Biondi said something earlier today. I promised this yesterday. The term capitalism wasn't in vogue, wasn't even existing in Say's times. This is 1803 up to 1825 or so. It was coined by Marx, but the word capitalist had existed for many decades, and it's in Say's treatise and it's in other people's treatise. But I wanted to point out that this can be helpful to remember when you're doing what I call the etymology of these systems. And someone earlier already went through the idea that, if you look at communism, socialism, fascism, the root words are it's groupism, it's collectivism. And although capitalism does not have the opposite, the individualist, connotation, it is really important, and I'm not sure, I don't recall Ayn Rand pointing this out. She did point out the Marx connection. But its root is head. Caput, think of all these ways the head of something is conveyed. The captain of a ship, the capstone of a bridge, the capital of a country, decapitation, you lose your head, per capita income. Capita means head. Right? This is the system for the men of the mind. Capitalism is best understood, I think, if you're in any argument with anybody, because of course Marx said, I'm calling it capitalism because it's a system that disproportionately favors these bastard capitalists, helps them exploit labor. So that's why he called it capitalism. It was actually a very clever. So he's saying this is a systemized theft going on, right? So we obviously don't believe that. But don't be shy about the word. I think it's a wonderful word. I wish he had actually said that. This is a wonderful word, because you can say, we have the system that protects, enshrines, and celebrates the head, the brains, the brilliance, the best and the brightest. And you have a system that institutionalized the protection of that. It's like a high-tech bicycle helmet. This is the most important thing. You've got to protect that head. Let it work. And he's extolling the essence of this. Rand has to deal with the kind of nefarious view of capitalism that comes from Marx. Now, Say is also interesting because he extols what's called the division of labor, which is a principle that Adam Smith discovered, and it is the source of the wealth of nations unless we specialize and divide. But unlike others, including Smith, and then Marx and Ricardo and all the people around him who still held to the labor theory of value, the idea that only manual physical labor creates value, Say said, no, the mind is the main source of value. He also, therefore, rejected the kind of exploitation theory that comes out of that. I mean, after all, if labor physical labor is the main source of wealth, why would white-collar workers be making so much money? They're not physically laboring, they're mentally laboring. They're not only getting paid, they're getting paid more than the blue-collar workers, right? So Marx and these others, and even Adam Smith, sadly, came out against this. So they said, it does create the wealth of nations, but it has this kind of exploitative, alienating aspect to it. Say doesn't have that, which is nice. He also has, interestingly, you remember Ayn Rand's point about the pyramid of ability. Who contributes the most to production, the top or the bottom. And Say has the same thing, only he ranks productive when he lists and explains the most productive people in the culture. He starts with, get this now, Professor Biondi, philosophers. The first thing he names is philosophers. Because he says if they don't get it right, there's no basis for it. Then he goes on to, and scientists, and then inventors, engineers, and the last one he mentions is entrepreneurs. And any mention of manual labor in Say is something like this lowly, crude labor, this lowly, crude form of labor, which is just, physical. It's not going to add a lot of value. Now, I mentioned that if you think, wealth is not muscles, doesn't come from muscles, as Andy Bernstein one time, the Popeye theory of muscles. Muscles is what produces wealth. Olive. And if it's mental, then the entrepreneur is going to be an important role. He's basically the hub in the system that Say has, bringing together raw materials and intelligence. It's not just a division of labor. There has to be a synthesis and organization of labor. Who does that? It's not in Smith or these other people. It's in Say. He says these are the guys who put things together. They're entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneur is, quote, occupied with setting in motion, see the prime mover idea, very cool, of every class of industry. This kind of labor requires a combination of moral qualities, notice, not just practical, moral qualities as well, not often found together. Judgment, perseverance, knowledge of the world as well as of business. He's called upon to estimate with tolerable accuracy the importance of the specific product, probable amount of demand, means of its production, collecting labors, finding consumers, giving at all times a rigid attention to order and economy. I mean, this is how this conference was run, with order and economy. And everything started on time. This was done in an entrepreneurial way. This is a passage, by the way, where he's describing why entrepreneurs would be paid more than others. They're in a way, morally superior. And here's more on compensation, which again, I won't go through. There's a reason, he says, why they're paid better. Okay, so Rand's focus, we know, is also on the mind, not that mind alone does it, but she too has a pyramid of ability. She too shows that it's done without exploitation. And she obviously prizes and explains businessmen and entrepreneurs as really the productive dynamos and moral heroes of the system. And as I put it here, and this is somewhat handled in the Economics and Atlas Shrugged that I published, but the 6 areas I named and explained as I went through Atlas Shrugged, which I call, I say unwittingly. Ayn Rand never did anything unwittingly, but she didn't know who Say was. So that's the only reason why I use unwittingly. Dramatizes Sayesian principles. So the 6 I found was the source of wealth, the role of businessman or the entrepreneur, the nature of profit. She's very good on the essence of competition. If you remember all the dramatizations of competition in Atlas Shrugged, some of them which are very witty, actually. The result of production, that's not often discussed, and the purpose of money. I think there was actually a 7th in there where I discussed the organization of Galt's Gulch, what her utopia actually looked like. Anyway, at every stage in these areas, there are principles that Say expounded. So this is amazing. Here's a philosopher novelist, not an economist, who actually didn't read much direct economics, who got these 5 or 6 key principles in economics correct. It's remarkable. It's amazing. And finally, some on the nature of government. because this is important, right? You can be for capitalism, production, entrepreneur, but what is your theory ultimately of capitalism? It's ultimately a political conception or a political economic conception. You have to have a pretty correct sense of government. Is this going to be anarchism? Is this going to be like a Hayekian, mixed economy where the government is providing a mini welfare state? No, he says political economy recognizes, key thing, the right of private property solely as the most powerful encouragement to the multiplication of wealth, right? He says later, it's political theory that it would have to show why this also is a human right, and it is. The legal inviolability of property is a mere mockery where the sovereign power is unable to make the laws respected. Wow, now listen, this is like the beginnings of Napoleonic France, so this may reflect the situation here as well. Whether it practices robbery itself or is impotent to repress it in others, or whether possession of wealth, private property is rendered perpetually insecure by the intricacy of the legislative enactments and the subtleties of technical nicety. In other words, the proliferation of laws, of regulations, of arbitrary selective enforcement. Very bad for rights, very bad for production. There is no security of property where a despotic authority can possess itself of the property of the subject against his consent. And this is a nice summary of his view. This is a government that's limited to protecting rights, specifically property rights, most important to economic prosperity, the healthy state of industry being one of state of absolute liberty, each interest left to take care of itself. The only useful protection government can afford them is that against fraud and violence. Interestingly, Say has this more restricted role for government than Smith. Adam Smith, who's known for being a free market economist, has many more interventions, including like against usury, and Smith wanted government public education, a very serious intervention. Say did not. So he's very clean and crisp and clear on this. And a little bit on why atlases would shrug, because he was accused of not having a theory of recession and why things would collapse. But some of these phrases, again, I won't go through, but he says, when there's punitive taxation, when there's crazy and punitive regulation, the producers will basically quit. They will basically, he describes capital flight, he describes hoarding. You just sit on your money and do nothing as a kind of striking. And this is the beginning of his theory of why we have recessions. Couple final reflections. This is from the Romantic Manifesto, and I think it's very apropos for the theme of the conference. She says, and apropos what Alex just talked about in flourishing, is just as man's physical survival, now that's what Say's largely focused on, right? Material prosperity depends on his own efforts, so does his psychological survival. A man faces two corollary interdependent fields of action in which a constant exercise of choice and a constant creative process are demanded. All of which further down makes his life worth living. He's born without the knowledge of either. He has to discover both and translate them into reality. He has to survive by shaping the world and himself in the image of his values. Let me finish by saying there's a certain way of going at life in a Say's law, primacy of production way, that we're producing ourselves. We're producing ourselves every day, like in the way that Ayn Rand is speaking about. We're creating our character. We're creating what economists call human capital, our assets, our skills. But these include things like our virtues and our capacities to be good people and to be good rational people and vibrant, industrious people, And if that's the focus, and I'm sure it is for most people in this audience, but it's a rare thing I find, that people are so concerned with how they are in their image, in the eyes of others, how others will see them, how others will demand them, how others might consume them, and it becomes all-consuming. And it really hurts their life, right? We see this, a constant preoccupation with where am I and will people accept me? And, you know, and the Say's law approach would be create yourself, create your value. The demand will come. If people see you as successful, vibrant, vital, they'll want to buy the product. They too may be inspired to do the same thing themselves. Then you have a very nice trader principle and a very nice exchange. So that's the closest I can come to using Say's law to kind of inspire you to be the best that you can be and focus on the personal best. Thank you. Okay, questions? Again, right after, starting at 5:30, I'll be in that back room with books. So we get about 20 minutes, yeah.
Great.
15 minutes, okay.
Did Say invent the term entrepreneur, or was it used much before him?
It was initiated with him, yeah. The only predecessor was a man named Cantillon, Cantillon, who spoke of an adventurer, and even that word, adventure. But yes, entrepreneur starts with Say. It's a French word, yeah. Sometimes translated as adventurer, but entrepreneur starts with him, yeah. And again, there's no entrepreneur theory in Smith, if you have an invisible hand, which is his favorite line, like guiding production, you're not going to have visible hands. There was a very famous Harvard Business School professor, Chandler, a really, really very good book, if you know it, yeah, Alfred Chandler, right? 1977, I read it in business school many years ago, and it was called The Visible Hand, subtitle, The Managerial Revolution in American Business or something like that. A very clever title because he was basically leveraging off of Smith saying, now this stuff just doesn't happen spontaneously. Like Hayek would say, right, it's all spontaneous order, it just happens. No, it doesn't happen. It has to be organized by people, by a visible hand, by a directing intelligence.
First of all, thank you for that information on Say. I knew very little about Say before yesterday and today, and I really appreciate that, and also your friend Olby, who I've never heard of before. Interesting that they wrote the things that they did in the era that they did, the early 1800s, and I have to presume that in many North American universities, they must have been taught to some extent.
Yeah.
And yet, given that and the soundness of their message, in alignment with objectivism, as we would now know, and yet views I would consider apologists for capitalism, such as Adam Smith with his invisible hand, I consider that really an apology. And also, but better captured by, whose name I can't remember, but I think he was an Episcopal priest, and I'll paraphrase a quote, that he pointed out what appeared to him to be a dichotomy, that private vice leads to public benefit. Perhaps you remember who it was that said that. It was a strange name, I can't remember that. Yes, Mandeville. Yes, thank you. Right. That view of what capitalists, or all of us, go about seeking their own happiness and producing benefit not only for themselves but consequentially for other people, it wasn't Say's view that took hold. It was the views of Smith and Mandeville, and then John Stuart Mill and Bentham and all that. My question for you is, do you have a theory as to why the apologists...
I reject the premise.
Okay.
His views did have influence. I said yesterday that his book was used as a textbook in America for 50 or 60 years. That's one thing. So he did have an influence, and he did bring attention to the entrepreneur, and there were more studies of the entrepreneur after him. But then also, the next major revolution in economics was 1870. For those of you who know the history, the marginal revolution. It was the recognition that the labor theory of value was wrong. And economists universally rejected it, starting with Menger, Jevons, and Walras. So they came up with utility theory, but Say had done that already. So I would argue that Say was even influential in creating the marginal revolution. Had that not occurred, there would not have been the overthrow of the labor theory of value, which fed and fueled Marxism. So, and Say, in his constellation, Say was the only one who rejected the labor theory of value. So Marx, Ricardo, Smith, Malthus, they're all saying that wealth comes from physical labor. He didn't, so I reject the premise a little bit. I mean, later, yes, starting like in 1890 or so and onward, Say's law was thrown out, Keynesianism came back. So, but he and his views did dominate political economy in the 19th century.
For a while, yeah. But that was my point. It hasn't carried the day up
No.
through into the 20th century.
No.
Even though it seemed to have a very firm foundation.
Because the philosophy changed. He comes out of the Enlightenment, and that's great political economy coming out of the Enlightenment. But then there's a counter-Enlightenment. These things take about 100 years, right? So Critique of Pure Reason is 1783. That sets the groundwork for, well, roughly 100 years later, it starts going bad. And then Say is out. Yes, that has to go out because it's pro-capitalist and it's pro-reason and it's pro-entrepreneur and it's pro these virtues. Those have to go out. We need to look for someone like, I don't know, Keynes, who says my system is perfect for a totalitarian system, when I quoted yesterday.
Thanks for the talk. I really appreciated it. I learned a lot from it. My question was, towards the end of this talk, you just briefly mentioned some of the things that can cause recessions. And I was wondering if Say was alive today, would he agree with most free market economists that the principal cause of the 2008 financial crisis was the Federal Reserve's arbitrary manipulation of interest rates, or something else?
I would say yes to that. I wouldn't say that's the only thing he would name. But he was certainly of the view that money should be gold. I never even mentioned his view of money. That money should be gold, that it should be stable, that the government shouldn't be running it or manipulating, let alone issuing fiat paper money. But I think he might well have focused on that, but as well things like artificially trying to favor one sector versus another. He's very big on this idea that you can't do fake. Well, there's fake news, right? And then there's fake demand for housing, because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac says everyone must own a house. The minute that was even begun, which was way prior to 2009, Say would have said, okay, this is a disaster waiting to happen. You need to let these sectors be in their natural condition and supply and demand, settling out in each sector. You cannot be pumping up special favors of some sectors versus another. It's going to cause the true imbalances that ultimately cause recessions. But that's not the market itself failing. That's not too many houses were built. That was the anti-Say's law approach. It was that they were artificially inflated by government.
Okay, thanks. And if I could ask just a sort of follow-up question. For Say's law, one of the implications that he himself argued for is that general gluts can't occur, like widespread excessive supply over demand.
Right.
And nowadays, lots of economists say that, like the financial crisis is an example of a glut.
Yes.
So any comments on that?
Well, he would reject the idea that you can have an aggregate excess of supply. He would just reject the whole apparatus. By the way, what I did not mention is he'd also reject the other way, which is often cited as the cause of inflation. Now get this. The cause of recessions, according to this Keynesian view, is we produce too much in total. And the stuff just piles up and everyone has to go home and be unemployed. That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but that's roughly it, not to give too short shrift to it. But the opposite would be insufficient supply. Like, what if aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply? Again, Say would say impossible, they are the same things. But according to the Keynesians, that's what causes inflation. Get that now. In Say's view, what is aggregate demand? It's aggregate supply. It's the stuff that's supplied, right? Why would the supply of goods cause inflation? Inflation is a decline in the value of money. If anything, it's an excess production of money relative to what's demanded. So even the view, so both the view of recession and the view of inflation on the Keynesian view is totally wrong. And like the Federal Reserve right now is operating on the second one. It's saying, well, the employment rate is really low. Aggregate demand is starting to exceed aggregate supply. The economy is overheating. Did you hear these words before? It's like an engine. It's overheating. We need to cool down the engine by slowing down the car, possibly kicking it into a ditch, and causing a recession, which would fight inflation. You see how crazy this stuff is? But policy is actually being implemented this way. So I don't know if that helps, but there's two sides of this. Either aggregate supply exceeds aggregate demand, according to them, or the other way around, and they both cause problems. And Say is saying in both cases, he said, there's no such thing, they're an identity. Stop assuming they're not. an identity. You see, by the way, why, if in some subsector, which is perfectly possible, a specific glut, not a general glut. Say there are too many houses, right? And there's an excess of, the price is going to come down, right? And eventually the two will equilibrate. But that means there's insufficient supply somewhere else. I mean, people don't have enough supply to buy or incomes to buy the house, right? So that's why in aggregate, you cannot have an excess of one over the other. They're an identity, they're the same thing. So to reject this is to reject the law of identity in production. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, you're welcome.
Did Say, when he speaks of capitalists, does he mean simply entrepreneurs, or does he have that distinction between capitalists and entrepreneurs?
Good question. He does have the distinction. So for Say, the capitalist supplies capital, supplies financial capital, lends the money or provides equity. The entrepreneur may also put his money in, but Say says the entrepreneur, qua entrepreneur, that function includes getting financial capital, not like raising money on Wall Street, but then also getting labor and having a business plan and getting the patents lined up. So you see, the entrepreneur is the center of it all. Financial capital coming in, tangible capital coming into the enterprise, those things are factors of production. But the entrepreneur is that special type of laborer, really, who is so intelligent and so creative that he's putting the whole thing together. But that's a good point. Sometimes they're collapsed together, capitalist and entrepreneur, in other people's thought, and they really should be separated. You could have, a CEO who doesn't own any shares of a company, therefore he's not an owner, he's not providing capital, he's not a capitalist, but he's certainly an entrepreneur if he's a good CEO.
Yes.
Good distinction, thank you.
So, on the invisible hand,
Yes.
I get really tired of people taking Smith, people, I guess, who don't have the ability to recognize a metaphor when it says, as if by, right in front of it. So it's like people take that as a literal statement from him, and it was just kind of a way for him to explain how things work in a free economy, and not actual literal invisible hand, as the opponents of free markets like to say. And then the other thing I'm curious about is, I know it's been difficult to get translations of Say's texts, and I'm wondering if any more of that has become available that you're aware of.
Okay, good question. So the second one first. I meant to mention this. In the handout, if you still have it, in the handout, you can get Say's writings online because of, so they're in PDFs and stuff like that. So, and I give you the links in the handout. So, and on the translations, remember I said the last 3 years of his life he taught? All his lecture notes and which is way more than a treatise, is available in French, but not yet in English. And it's being translated now. This is part of the revival, I said, part of the good news, part of the revival in Say is scholars finally going back saying everything he did should be translated. But those, I've seen them, and I can read a little bit of French, so I've read enough to know, especially the sections on Say's law, that these are wonderful big elaborations of the principles that are in the treatise. The treatise is like 350 pages long, but the Cours Complete is 800 or 900 pages long. So a lot of good stuff to mine. On invisible hand, I think the invisible hand concept, I think I know what you're saying. It's usually derided by anti-market people. Mm-hmm. But I think it's actually worth deriding. I think it's a bad way to explain how markets work, and it feeds into their critique, because they'll say, really invisible, you see it, but I don't. And so it is really a weak way, but also it's primacy of consciousness. This is not just using a metaphor. This is Smith saying, I don't really have an explanation why all this coordinates so well. It's as if an invisible hand, that's how he puts it, is coordinating it all. That sounds very theistic. It is very theistic. And the only other 2 times, by the way, he uses 2 other times he uses invisible hand. Only 3 times does he use it. But the other time is in the essay on astronomy. So he's trying to explain that, or using as a metaphor, how do the planets, well, an invisible hand makes sure they rotate properly. So if you look at other parts of Smith, it is a very cosmological type, non-rational thing. So it's not a good thing. And then when you see, well, the reason he's doing this, he doesn't have the visible hand of the entrepreneur doing it. And that's why he's pitched, by the way, as, well, he believes in spontaneous order. What is spontaneous order? I don't know, that famous pin factory he describes where, just look, people are, the pin, there's 18 different steps and they're making a simple pin, and that's his opening thing. It's a famous pin factory example showing division of labor, right? And as I say to students, how did this factory come about? People just showed up at the corner of Elm and Maine one day and started making pins, and there's no job descriptions, there's no... and it's not spontaneous. It's deliberate design. Same thing with the American Constitution. That was deliberately designed by framers. They use the word framers, which sounds like an architect, right? This is not, well, we just spontaneously showed up in Philadelphia one day. This is all very interesting. Some things are, but the Austrians and others are worried about planning. If you plan something, you're a would-be, Stalinist. So it's a very weird thing in Austrian view. Hayek and others, the reason they push spontaneous order is they think that deliberate design is deliberately devious. Usually, they're very suspicious of top-down planning design because unfortunately history does show a lot of this as bad design. But that's my riff against invisible hand. Hi, Adam.
Hi, and thank you. And
welcome.
how would you contrast Bastiat and Say?
Well, that's a good distinction. Frederick Bastiat, who is, dates are like 1800 to 1850, so he died very early. He died of tuberculosis. And Say died in 1832, so there's a little bit of overlap, but the basic difference is Bastiat is more religious. And Bastiat focuses more, and he's very good actually, but Bastiat focuses more on exploding fallacies. So the two of them, so the religious part doesn't help that much. But if you strip that out of Bastiat, it's very good. He's not quite as sophisticated as Say, so he's more of a popularizer. I think he was actually a journalist, which is not a bad thing. It just means you do write for an audience. You're trying to make yourself explainable. That's why his writing is so, he's like Hazlitt, very easy to read. But to focus on the polemics of refuting your enemies versus explicating actual true principles, that's a fairly big difference. And Say is much more on the idea of, let me tell you what is true in a logical structure that all makes sense. And yes, I will criticize Malthus a little bit on the side, but that's not my main project. And so the two of them read together is good in that regard. You get Say's principles, there's your foundation. Bastiat, who was totally pro-Say, he loved Say and touted him all the time. It actually has this really moving phrase. I'm trying to remember where it was in Economic Sophisms, or it could have been in his Political Economy, where Bastiat says, because now the French socialists are rising up in the 1830s. Bastiat's in his 30s. That's where socialism began in France in the 1830s. And Bastiat at one point says, pick up this torch of Say's law and light the world again, because it's going dark. This is terrible. Unless we regain... Now, Say's law was, still prominent then, but Bastiat was concerned that the socialists and the Marxists were coming up and saying, general gluts, and we need to shut down capitalism and its productiveness, and that's how much he loves Say, so I hope that helps. Done.
Yes,
thank you so
you.
much. Thank you.